Absolutely. Yeah. I was really grateful that you thought of this and that you reached out to me and said, let's discuss, because I think not only is it lovely for us as humans to get to have this conversation, but I think so many people have so many feelings around this issue and these tragedies. And even, I talk a lot about how kids don't know how to start conversations like that, but I think adults also don't know how to start conversations about that. And a lot of us don't know how to organize our thoughts about it, how to put it into words, how to, I think one of the things that's hardest about this, this sort of unique concept, and this is all in relative terms, so I hope everybody understands, hardest being an ultimate luxury, is that tragedies like school shootings feel so personal, even though they're not happening to us. And yet society tells us that we're not really allowed to grieve because it didn't happen to us. And it leaves us in an emotional middle ground where it's very hard to figure out what we're allowed to feel and what to do with those feelings. And I love helping people find ways to channel those feelings. When it's kids, I encourage them to write about it. When it's adults, I encourage them to vote and get involved in organizations and things like that. But I think the bottom line is just that we all contain this like huge sadness watching these events happen. But because they didn't happen, thank God, directly to us, we are also left with a feeling of that we are supposed to be okay and we're not okay. And that's really confusing. I
really appreciate you giving voice to that. That's really like,
well, and for a long time, I struggled with that too, because, there were the years of thinking about this and writing Aftermath and trying to get it published. And a lot of people asked me sort of, who are you to tell this story if it's not about you personally? I, thank goodness, I'm not a survivor of gun violence. And so a lot of people said, like, why do you care? Why is this your story to tell? And I'm always clear, it's not my story to tell, but I do think it's my job as a storyteller to start conversations. And that's a difference. I'm never going to promise, I'm never going to pretend that I'm not a therapist. I'm not a survivor. I'm not, any of those things, but I'm a journalist. My background is in journalism. So I did my research and, certainly have worked on the writing aspect of it and the sort of human psychology aspect of it in terms of doing research and talking to experts and therapists and teachers and people. But when it comes down to it, I think this is a problem that we're not going to solve until we all take it personally.
Yeah.
The problem of gun violence is like, we have to act every time like it happened to us in order to do something.
That's so right. That is so right. And I think even sort of the wave of becoming a parent, I remember my first experience with my son telling me about a lockdown drill. And it was as if, we have these empathic capabilities. You imagine yourself, wait, I didn't have that experience. I only had fire drills and earthquake drills in California. Like there's a whole other drill that my child is going through. And that sort of cracked open for me, just the possibility of that. Exactly. Then you start.
And that in itself too is a kind of trauma. Living in a world where we have to prepare for this is traumatic. And I'm never going to pretend like it's as traumatic as it is for people to whom it actually happens or people who lose loved ones in shootings. But I also think it's important, like I was saying, about sort of owning that grief and figuring out what to do with it, is also owning the trauma that we all live in this world where we're prepared all the time, whether it's through drills or thinking about it, or every time you drop your kid off from school or writing a book or reading a book about, the fact that we have to think about this is terrifying and in and of itself is a trauma. And I hope that all the guns get banned tomorrow. I know it's not going to be tomorrow. Even so, we still have a generation of kids who are dealing with that fear and having practiced and rehearsed that fear. And also, I read something today, and I don't have the exact statistics, but it was, I believe it was on March for Our Lives page. And they were saying that the statistical likelihood of every kid in America today running into another person in their lifetime who is a direct survivor of gun violence is incredibly high. Like our kids are going to encounter kids when they go to college, when they go to camp,
Sure.
The way that I don't know about you, when I was growing up, I had a lot of friends whose parents, really their dads, had served in Vietnam.
Mm.
And that was actually kind of one of the inspirations for writing Aftermath, because I saw a lot of those people, Vietnam, I think, was unique in its, or at least it was sort of the beginning of wars that America was fighting, where the general population was not necessarily supportive and grateful the way that they were World War I, World War II, where there was this feeling of pride and patriotism, and people came back and they were heroes, and there were GI Bills, and they got to go to college. And I mean, I'm not saying that was all great either. Like, obviously they still like sacrificed a lot and saw horrors, and lots of people lost their lives. But starting with Vietnam and then getting into, Afghanistan and Iraq and our more current wars, there's a lack of appreciation and patriotism. And I'm a pacifist. I'm not crazy about it, but the way that our society treats veterans has changed, and we don't take good care of them when they come home. And that became a generational problem. And statistically, if you look, a lot of Vietnam vets suffered from PTSD and depression, alcoholism, domestic violence. There's, the statistics are huge. And I think that for our kids' generation, and somewhat for our generation as parents, that issue is gun violence, that these kids are all dealing with this sort of either low level or in some cases high level of just consistent trauma that we're not necessarily dealing with, but I think hopefully we're going to start dealing with it.
So that when you say hopefully, I mean, in a sense, like also Aftermath is coming, to me, it felt like this of the Sandy Hook generation, right? Or I don't know, when your inspiration was from that or from a series of things.
It's funny.
So many years.
It was a couple of years after that, but I think it just, I mean, obviously it's collective, and I've found the more time I have worked as a writer, the more I've figured out sort of what my process is, and is that you probably hear other writers say this, but a lot of writing is not writing. And so it's all that time that you spend doing other things when the ideas are percolating. And I felt like the idea for Aftermath came to me really suddenly, but I now can look back and see that it was building over many years and over many events. And so I started writing it directly after a shooting in San Bernardino in 2015, but obviously Sandy Hook, Columbine, all of those things are very much a part of like what for years must have been kind of lurking in my subconscious. So yes.
Yeah. And so now it's like creating that art from that trauma for you. And I wonder what maybe advice or thoughts you have for young people, for adults who are just sort of, again, just sort of like living with this sense of either how do we become active, or how do I exorcise these intense feelings that we're having.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think when I started writing Aftermath, it was sort of a very, for lack of a better word, selfish act of like, I had all these feelings and I didn't know what to do with them. And, art and therapy are so closely linked. And, when you can positively tease them apart and treat both of them obviously is best. Like, there is a place for art and there's a place for therapy. But and I am a fan of both. I've been in therapy for a long time, but sometimes I think we don't realize exactly what we're working on with art, until after it comes out. And I think, for me, certainly it was just this feeling of like needing a place for all of this feeling to go. And then I think for other people in other situations, sometimes art is processing what you don't even know you're thinking about. It might be subconscious and it's getting it out, as opposed to, for me, it felt like it was overflowing and I had to put it somewhere. And for some people, it might be opening the door. Art can serve all of these amazing different purposes. And again, as we just said, like clearly it's not a replacement for therapy. It's not instead of, it's, mental health is huge as an issue in the context of school shootings. And I think it's sort of on the wrong end. Like, people are always talking about the mental health of people who perpetrate shooters, which, like, I don't even know what to say about that. But really my concern about mental health and school shootings is the aftermath, literally.
Yeah.
So to me, like, yes, mental health is an issue, but maybe not in the way that a lot of politicians say it is. I'm not
Right.
saying, not the Republican way where it's like, oh, we just need better. It's no, we need to deal with the trauma of this. And I think writing and performing can have such an incredible impact. I'm lucky to have a background as a performer, and I've found my whole life ways to process that, whether it was through music, through dance, through theater, now through writing. My kids are really into visual art, and we often use that too as a tool of, if somebody's in a bad mood or having a lot of feelings, I'll be like, go draw it, like go work it out, and then let's talk about it, because oftentimes they don't even know, they don't necessarily have the words or the sort of brain organization to talk about it. And sometimes we need to process stuff through art.
Yeah.
So, I think there's no limit to what can be, what conversations can be started through art. And then sometimes those conversations need to get finished, in therapy with a professional, or sometimes, the art is catharsis enough. And then, there's the process of sharing the art, which then is a chain reaction and provides catharsis for other people, or processing for other people. I'm sure you talk about this, but being an audience member is just as important as being an artist. And so receiving that as an audience member can be just as epic and, spiritual an experience. So if you're a reader and you read a book, or if you're in the audience of a play and you see it, or you experience music, any of that, you don't have to just be the person who makes the art. So there's just so many ways that this can be helpful, I think, in times of great stress and grief.
Yeah, right. Well said. Yeah. I remember seeing Columbinus at New York Theater Workshop, one of the first plays I saw when I came to New York. And that was just extraordinary, both as an artistic event, and then also, yes, to come together in community and just be like, we're all witness to this. And
yes, the community aspect of it, I think, is huge. I think that's a really good point. I think part of it is that art can be experienced both individually and communally, and that's really special. And there are some people who need to process it individually, and there are some people who need a group. And like, how special and amazing that it can serve both purposes. I mean, again,
for people who are, well, I mean, and now we're just in a place of, I'm not necessarily, we're maybe making art about this yet, but where we can go communally to just march, to grieve, to all those things. I mean, I know March for Our Lives is organizing another rally in June in DC. Are there other organizations that you want to highlight? I mean, you are yourself just such a font of wisdom about all of this and where to put that urge.
Yeah, I mean, the timing of this tragedy, I mean, it's so sad, because we're really talking about not just the shooting that just happened in Texas, but days before the shooting that happened in Buffalo. And there was one in between that was like smaller in Southern California. And it's so funny how we judge these. And then I just want to say, because not to be a downer, but I think because this is important context, is that if you look at the actual numbers, the volume of this shooting happens ×4 every day in America. So if we're all really focused on the shooting in Texas, because there's something really visceral and heartbreaking about the details, and it being in a school, and we can all picture it. We've all been there. It's like more relatable in some way, which is terrible, but this is the world we're living in. And a lot of people are really focused on that.
Yeah.
In the number. But if you look at the number, and I'm not saying that this is not any less tragic.
I know.
But the count so far, I think, is 21, 22, depending how we count it. There have been some sort of ripple effect tragedies. There's usually about 100 or more people killed by single incident gun violence, or smaller, 2 or 3 people in an incident gun violence every day. So unfortunately, the situation in Texas is tragic, but if we paid attention to the overall numbers, we would be grieving this every day ×4, which is horrible. And yet it has to be said, because that's part of the problem too. I think we all have a tendency, like I said, the school shootings are particularly emotional, and they're so relatable because we've all been in school, or we know someone who's in school, or we can picture it. It's so visceral for us, but unfortunately that's just one part of this horrible puzzle. So I think that needs to be said. And then the other thing I want to say, and then I know I've gotten a little bit off topic of what to do about it, but there is so much emphasis on the number of people who die from gun violence. And while that is obviously horrible and tragic, it is really important, I think, to think about, as empathetic people and artists, think about all the people who are affected by gun violence who don't die, and obviously surviving something is always good. We like when people live. That's a positive. But then we as a society, again, sort of tend to forget the people who went through the same thing as the people who died and yet lived. And they need so much support now. So if you think about all those kids, there were hundreds of kids in elementary school.
Yes.
And unfortunately, 19 of them so far, I hope it's just 19 of them died. There's, almost 2 dozen more in the hospital. Then there's hundreds more kids who hid under their desks and listened to the whole thing. So it's just the sort of waves. And then there's thousands and hundreds of thousands of more kids like ours who read the news and know about this, so there are levels of trauma, and they're not all equal, but it's huge. And so I wrote the book. Again, I'm not a therapist, I'm not a teacher, I'm not many of those things. I can't even begin to wrap my head around how to help those kids in sort of the immediate situation. But the kids on the outside ripple, the first step is empathy, and is thinking about putting yourself in their shoes. And that's what I wrote the book for. So what I was saying before about the timing is June 3rd is a really special holiday. Holiday is the wrong word. Day when we all gather for Moms Demand and Everytown, which are 2 organizations. I think a lot of people don't know this, but Everytown.org is sort of an umbrella organization for other organizations, one of which is Moms Demand. And Moms Demand has been incredibly effective and incredible at gathering people, because I think, for better or for worse, I don't like gender stereotypes. I hate, dividing people up by gender. However, for whatever reason, this issue has been really galvanizing for a lot of women who happen to have children. But I like to talk about Everytown in general, because I hope there are people watching this and thinking about this who are not moms, who are dads, who are single people, who don't identify with one gender or the other. So let's just say Everytown and Moms Demand together, because it's just, Everytown is more inclusive by nature of being an umbrella organization. No shade to Moms Demand, of which I am a member. So June 3rd is Wear Orange Day, which is it was created after there was a young woman who was shot. Her favorite color was orange, and her loved one started doing this, and it caught on, and has become sort of the day of rallying cries. And it happens to be June 3rd, and this incident, in Texas and the one in Buffalo are sort of, the timing is funny, because now we're headed up to this day where we've all been preparing regardless. And so, I think the purpose of a lot of these occasions are about creating community. And I do think that is a huge first step in making change, and people feeling less alone, feeling empowered to speak up. But some of it is also just sort of the communal grieving part. Like, I'm looking forward to putting on my orange shirt and going out into, a public space where people are gathering, and seeing all the other people in orange shirts, and being there together, and knowing that we're all in this together, and there are other people who are feeling the pain I'm feeling. And that's not for nothing. That's an important part of this. And then the next step is, what do we do about that? So I love Everytown and Moms Demand. Wear Orange is June 3rd. You don't have to do anything to celebrate it, other than, if you have an orange piece of clothing, wear it, go out. And when you see somebody else wearing orange, you get this nice sort of feeling that we're all working on this. And then beyond that, there are a lot of opportunities to sign up, to get involved, to volunteer, phone bank, text bank, knock on doors. What Moms Demand has done really well, and Everytown, is support candidates for running for local offices who are gun sense candidates. And that
Yes.
can mean everything. I like how they use those terms, which are really inclusive, which is we're not saying anti-gun, although I personally, not a fan of guns in general, but I do see that for some people in some situations, there are uses for guns. So we're not anti-guns, we are gun safety.
Yes.
And that is, I think like a more unifying approach to this topic, and
Absolutely.
not just saying like, ban
Yep.
them all.
Yep.
So, there are a lot of opportunities to get involved to support candidates who are running for local office. Another organization I love that I think we should link to is the States Project.
Wonderful.
And their mission is not just gun control. I mean, the great thing about the States Project is any issue that you're feeling these days, whether it's abortion access, trans rights, gun violence, the States Project is the place to go. So what they do is they focus in on local races and flipping seats in state legislatures to be Democratic. Because a lot of these laws, as we've seen, are decided in state and local government, whether it's abortion access, trans and gay rights, LGBTQ issues, gun safe storage. Texas unfortunately recently passed a law that allows people to open carry guns everywhere. And I'm not going to say that this particular shooting wouldn't have happened had there not been that law, but it's just sort of, because I think when people are determined to do awful things, they're going to do awful things regardless. But it certainly stirs up the culture of acceptance of guns. And it does, the amount of accidental gun violence in America is incredibly shameful and particularly affects children. I mean, that just, I can't even wrap my head around the horrors of accidental. I mean, whatever, it's not like it's worse when it's an accident, it's bad every way. But so many of those issues are decided locally. And as everybody can see, when people say, I feel hopeless, like this gun violence is never going to get fixed or whatever that is, I think they're often looking at the top. They're looking at Congress and the Senate and the gridlock in Washington, and they're seeing that we've been wanting, we meaning the majority of Americans want common sense gun legislation. We're not in the minority here. But the very vocal minority is making that impossible. And so the States Project is saying, let's get in from the bottom and fix this on the local level. And I think that's probably the most impactful thing that we can do at this juncture.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, good. Well, we'll be linking to all of that. And your book, Emily, just how wonderful. I know I had interviewed you when it first came out, but now I feel like I've just been seeing the ripple effect of the success of it, how many lists on, how impactful it's been to so many young people, how it's being, scooped up by libraries and schools and communities. And I'm so grateful that it's out there in the ecosystem now more than ever.
I mean, I really hoped that by this point it would be in the historical fiction section or in the post-trauma section, as opposed to the current events urgently needed right now section.
Right, of course,
right. But I mean, we said this over text. You texted and I wrote back that I was actually hopeful this time. And maybe I'm naive, but I'm more enmeshed in this world than ever because of the book and because of my commitment to donate money and raise awareness to gun safety causes. And I'm more hopeful than ever because I just meet so many people who want to help be part of the change on this issue. And also because of people like the States Project who have figured out the sort of
that change.
The sort of underground, like we've all been attacking it from the top and that didn't work. So like, we gotta go somewhere else. There was this beautiful, heartbreaking post, I think on Instagram or Twitter today, where a young woman who lives in Texas, in the town where this shooting happened, said, everybody keeps telling us to vote, but we are voting. The gerrymandering has made it so that our voices are not getting heard and we are trapped here. It was a really beautiful plea from this young woman who was like, we don't want this. We're not idiots who keep voting against our interests. The gerrymandering is such that our voices are not getting through. And that broke my heart. And that's the kind of thing that the States Project is really effective at fixing, because if we get good local government, they can redraw the boundaries so they're fair, so that people's votes are actually getting counted, and it's a ripple effect like everything, and it's slow change. We're not going to wake up tomorrow, unfortunately, to like a worldwide weapons ban. That's just not, unfortunately, how it works. I mean, I'd love to see an executive order, but again, because we live in a democracy as flawed as it is right now, and the difference between what states can do and what federal government can do, it's not going to be a quick fix, but I do think there's hope this time. And I, unfortunately, the more people who are affected directly, the more people get involved, and it stinks that we've added hundreds of families to that category with this tragedy. But we're, the movement gets stronger, and the more people take it personally and say, like, I'm not going to let this happen again. I don't want to live like this.
Yeah. Wonderful. I mean, I feel like, I hope that, we can all feel like if there's ever a rallying cry, it's now. And if we haven't, joined an organization, found that grassroots commitment,
there are small ways, and not everybody has money to give, but you can, take 10 minutes and text your senators or your Congress people. There's a newsletter that I love that's a daily action. It's called Chop Wood, Carry Water. And it's a Substack, and this woman named Jess Craven runs it, and she sends out a daily Substack with 5 minutes of activism that you can do each day. Amazing. Not with the expectation that everybody does all those 5 minutes every day, and I certainly don't. But when you have a day in your schedule where you're like, I got 5 minutes, it's like, text this number and an email prompt comes up, and you've just emailed your senators, or you sign petitions. It's little things, and not only is it effective, it's really empowering, and that feels really good. I think another important thing to come out of this is, certainly around the conversation of gun violence, a lot of people think that kids don't want to talk about it. And I think the opposite is true. Kids need to talk about it. They have a lot of questions. They've been taught that it's not appropriate. But I think that's the other reason that school shootings feel so tender to us, is because it's a situation where we absolutely cannot pretend that kids are not affected by gun violence. And I've had so many parents text me in the past couple of days and be like, how do I tell my kids? And I'm like, dudes, I'm sorry, your kids already know. Like, they know. And sure enough, parents will start this conversation. Kids are like, oh yeah, I heard at school, or I read it on the news. Like, I remember the moment my older kid turned 6 and she was reading, and I was like, we were at a pizza parlor in Brooklyn, and there was a TV on, and the news crawl was going along the bottom. And I was like, oh, this is the end of like me keeping secrets. That's it.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad you brought that up, Emily. And this is such a good thing to surface. I mean, really, I think there is that feeling of listen and respond to the questions. And in terms of just what to share, it's like there's age appropriate guide, right?
Yeah, there have been a lot of guides published. I mean, I think every major newspaper has put out their own guide. There's one I particularly liked that the Good Morning America team put out. That really broke it down by school age, elementary school kids. We can talk about this, middle school aged kids, high school age kids. And I found that really, obviously there are exceptions. You'll always have, a kid in elementary school who's really emotionally intelligent and aware. And you might have a kid in middle school who, like, for whatever reason, it hasn't crossed their mind yet. But those general breakdowns, I think, are pretty good categories to put it into. And like you said, you start by listening. You just start with the question of, hey, have you heard what's going on in the news? I'm here if you want to talk about it. And if they're like, I don't know and I don't want to know, that's okay. You leave the door open. And that's sort of like the bottom level conversation. And then there's a million steps after that. But I think when we involve kids in conversations like this, we give them the opportunity to do something about it, to get involved themselves, but we're also implicitly telling them that they can do hard things, and we're inspiring resilience. By not telling them and by avoiding it, we're implicitly sending the message, we don't think you can handle it. We don't think you know, are
And
strong
that
enough.
it's so scary that we're going to avoid it, and that avoiding scary things is what we do, which is obviously not. We have to kind of lean into these moments.
And I know it's like nobody wants to burst their kid's bubble and be like, hey, guess what? These things happen at school.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, the way we were raised with fire drills and earthquake drills, these kids were, from before they were born, they've been having active shooter drills. So in some ways, I had this discussion with a group of kids. I was doing a school visit virtually over Zoom with a school in North Carolina. And one of the teachers said, yeah, these kids, they're not shocked by it, unfortunately. They have never lived in a world, they were all born after Columbine. They have never lived in a world where school shootings weren't just like an unfortunate part of life. Like there are fires, there are floods, there are school shootings. And it's not that they don't care, that they're not scared, that it's not horrible. They're just not shocked because it's just been normal their whole life. And like, obviously I want to change that. But I think also we as their parents, because we're a different generation. I mean, I know you and I were in college when Columbine happened, and it was shocking. It was absolutely, it wasn't the first school shooting, but it was like a really, you know, landmark sort of publicized 24-hour news cycle, first big school shooting that happened in our like young adulthood. And I think every time a school shooting happens, we bring to it that sort of level of shock. And the next generation is like, yeah, it stinks. What are we doing about it? Not that they don't care, not that they're not sad.
Yeah.
But they've never lived in a world where that wasn't a possibility.
Yeah. Right.
So
that's right.
I hope that's in some ways comforting to parents, that like, again, it doesn't make it any better or any less sad, but our kids are living in a world where it's like super normal, unfortunately. So you're not going to shock them. What you're going to do is instill in them this feeling, this sense that you trust them to deal with hard things, and that you want to offer them hope and ways to help, ways to get help, and your honesty. Like those are the best things you can give your kids. I love to compare it to sex ed and abstinence only education. You know, the idea of abstinence only education is if we don't tell them about it, they won't figure out how to do it, which is so wrong. And also, like, if you've ever watched a nature documentary,
please,
every species figures out what sex is and how to do it, because that's how we all have continued to survive. So it's like, not talking about it isn't helping anybody. Obviously, you have to be age appropriate when it comes to both school shootings and sex, but avoiding the conversation and assuming that if you don't talk about it, it won't happen is not helpful to anyone. And it sends really dangerous messages to your kids about honesty and about really honestly their own capabilities. So, you know.
Yeah. My son's teacher was like, you know, they'll either find out about it on the playground, but we can actually, as adults, create a safe container for their questions. And
well, and that's another way that I think it's a perfect comparison to sex ed is like, do you want them to learn about sex from their peers or from the internet? Or do you want that first conversation and the introduction to come from you and your values or a book that you buy, or a conversation that you get to set the stage for? Same thing about gun violence is like, I think it's a lot less scarier when a parent explains. And as a parent, one thing I love being able to do is to say to my kids, yes, this is awful and I'm really sorry, but here are the things I'm personally doing to try and make it better.
Right. So being that inspiration.
It doesn't totally fix it, obviously, but it is hugely better than saying, I don't know. So
it's empowering for you and for them to then say, like, this is where I'm putting this hurt into.
Right. And I think that's another good reason to join an organization like Everytown or Moms Demand or contribute to the States Project. So you can look your kid in the eye and be like, yeah, this is a bad situation and here's what I'm doing to fix it. You know, and then some kids are like, I want to make a lemonade stand and send my money to one of those orgs. That's great. Other kids are just like not necessarily there, but the fact that they know that there are people out there who are doing constructive things, even if they're not ready to join, that's fine. But you do want to show them that there is hope and there are helpers, you know,
Yes.
they can be the helpers, or they can support the helpers, or they can just watch them and know that they're there. There
Yeah.
are so many ways to participate in this conversation. And if you give your kids those options, you're already like empowering them and taking away some of the, you know, sort of the anxiety and fear around the issue. We can't fully take away the anxiety and fear around the actual events. You know, those are very real and concrete, but what we can do is create a society. Also, these kids in 10 years, most of these kids that we're talking about, they're going to be voters.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
like if we can save this planet to the point where it's still available for them to inherit it in 10, 15 years, they're going to do a great job
Of voting.
Yeah. Of voting and
All the
creating
things.
the world that they're going to vote. They're going to vote for gun sense candidates.
Yeah.
They're going to support LGBTQ rights. They're going to make abortion access like just available everywhere.
Yes.
I have so much faith in the next generation. We just have to save the planet so that there is a next generation.
Yeah. Yep. Well said. Okay, well, that's another conversation.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Oh, Emily, thank you so much for your inspiration,
your
activism, your artistry. I really am so grateful to count you as a friend.
I'm so grateful that you suggested this conversation. And like I was saying at the beginning, it's like, it's healing for me personally to get to have this conversation with you, but I also hope that it's inspiring for other people to sort of loosen those knots of it being uncomfortable to talk about. You know, one great thing we can do is model having these conversations, and then it helps other people figure out how to start those conversations. And I really hope, you know, if one person watches this and comes away being like, I'm going to talk to my group of friends and say, hey, what are you guys doing? There's a giving circle. Maybe those people will join the States Project, become a giving circle, and flip a seat in a red state. You know, it's like, it's a shame that it's coming down to like these actions that we have to take on, that, you know, that it's not getting fixed by the president or Congress or Senate or these bigger entities, but it's in our hands and we could do it.
Yeah. Well done. Well said. Thank you so
much.
Thank you
so much. This was really
talking with you.
So great. Thank you. I appreciate it.